Hi, this is Graphically Alex coming at you with all things fat related. If that's something that interests you, please subscribe. I'd love to have you. And today I am going to be honestly figuring out what type of zombie this is. This is the fat positive therapist. I'm still struggling a little bit from my migraine yesterday. It was real bad at night. It was horrible. Yesterday or last night. Tonight, I just feel kind of depressed a little bit and in that like post-migraine feeling, post-migraine vibes. So it took me forever to find something that I could react to, but I felt like this is interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and play the whole thing and I'm going to try to figure out what she is because I haven't watched it. So let's go.
It's Kelly, your fat positive therapist. I wanted to hop on today to talk a little bit about fat trauma, but more specifically how my field of psychology has flipped around the concept of fatness in that people who are fat are traumatized, which in their definition, they're saying that if you exist in a fat body, you're intentionally seeking weight gain to avoid emotional processing, which is really far from the truth. Can being emotionally traumatized impact your relationship with food? Absolutely. Could that lead to weight gain? Absolutely. But there are fat people that exist that don't have bad relationships with food. There are fat people that have just always existed. So the assumption and belittling of, oh, you're fat because you're traumatized, why are you resistant to weight loss, is extremely dehumanizing. And it's built off this foundational assumption that if it's not the food addiction, you're actually choosing to gain weight to avoid like sexual assault, which is incredibly offensive because so many people in larger bodies have been sexually assaulted and aren't believed because they exist in a larger body, right? So it's super gross for a field of mental health to assume that someone has gained weight to avoid sexual assault. If you think that way, then yeah, we have some anti-fatness to work through, and that's totally fine. I'm holding space for that. But for the field to think that way is really gross. So, yeah. Hi, everyone. It's Kelly, your fat positive therapist. I wanted to hop on today to talk.
Okay, I think she's a stalker. So I'm clocking her as a level 2. She probably has a problem. That was really weird. The way she talked about it, it was kind of like a little bit logically inconsistent. But she seems sane on the surface, I guess. But it was just kind of odd. And then she still had the holier-than-thou attitude of a stalker. So for those of you guys that don't know, I use The Last of Us Zombies like to talk about the progression of the issue of many, and then what they tend to do. So she hides, they hide. Stalkers hide. And she's trying to do that whole thing of like appealing to logic or shaming the psychology industry or whatever. I have a feeling she's strawmanning what the psychology department or whatever you want to call it. I think she is strawmanning what the field of psychology says, basically, and then arguing against that. So I'm going to go ahead and break it down piece by piece. What I will say beforehand is just, it's definitely an issue of severity. So if somebody is super morbidly obese, there's something going on. So either there's deep physical issues, and yes, something like hypothyroidism or PCOS could be enough, but it would have to be pretty severe, in my opinion, if you're really, really big, because you're probably extremely hungry. So lots of insulin resistance, lots of problems that you need to be dealt with, period, for your health, period, even notwithstanding the weight. Because having rampant hypothyroidism or rampant PCOS, that is a problem for your health. So you have to think of it logically in that sense. It's not something to just neglect because we should accept all fat people for being fat. Like that's really like negligent, I think is the word. Neglecting. But for those that do have issues, if you're super morbidly obese and there is trauma, there's something going on. something happened. It's kind of rare to get that big without serious physical issues unless something happened. And sometimes you can have a combination of the two. You can have hormonal issues and some trauma. But regardless, there is at least a question or a reason to question if this has happened. If somebody is that big, especially if they're lying about it, if they're saying that they're not having that many cows, things like that. If it's unexplained, rapid upsizing, things like that. There's a lot of different physical signs that something's going on. And especially if it's accompanied by like a personality shift and other issues or other symptoms of trauma, basically, I think it's very much the case that something could be as a result of trauma. That a toxic ritualistic, or EFL by letter D, but on the channel I call it the toxic ritualistic, that a toxic ritualistic issue is occurring. And that would be BINGE in this case, if you're upsizing rapidly. So that can definitely happen. It's more common the bigger the person is. I'll put it to you that way. The bigger they are, the more common it is. It doesn't mean that every single person who's super big is that way, but it does mean that they usually are, especially if they're very, very, very big. Okay? Small fat, mid-size, etc., it's very different. It could be just laziness, bad diet, negligence, apathy. It could be your basic stress. So stress, eating, things like that. That could be enough, but it's usually not going to be that severe, or you're not going to be that big because it's fucking miserable. So there usually has to be something going on. But let me go ahead and rewatch it.
Talk a little bit about fat trauma, but more specifically how my field of psychology has flipped around the concept of fatness, in that people who are fat are traumatized, which in their definition, they're saying that if you exist in a fat body, you're intentionally seeking weight gain to avoid emotional processing.
So I think that obviously a psychologist could look at this on a case-by-case basis. I think it makes a lot of sense if you're talking to somebody and they're opening up about a trauma and you're seeing, for example, patterns of avoidance, basically, whether that stems from childhood, whether that stems from something traumatic that happened. If you're seeing that and you see other signs of the person being in the toxic ritualistic, which I do think therapists should know about, and I think BINGE is highly ignored and not seen as a real issue by a lot of people in psychology, I think you should be aware of that and you should be able to look at signs and stuff. So then you could make the connection. But I do agree that just seeing somebody out on the street or something and assuming you know everything is not really, I guess, like appropriate. When I tend to see, like, when I observe people like online, so people who have posted themselves, and I feel like a person has been traumatized, it's usually not just their size, it's the way that they talk, the way that they act, it's how deep they are in the issue. If they're hypersensitive, or, they're in that clicker stage, they're stage 3, so they're kind of like unhinged, or like yelling or crying really dramatically, or going into rage spells online and doing this kind of stuff, you can usually tell that something happened, that something's off, But it's because of the whole picture. Like, for example, if we look at Marissa Matthews, you can tell that she's been traumatized. You can tell. She has also stated it multiple times. but you can viscerally tell by how she acts that there's something wrong. So in that case, I would say, yeah, you can tell that she's that big, at least in some way, because of trauma. But does that mean that she's avoiding people? Not necessarily. You don't, I wouldn't say she is. So it's not always going to be that same thing, but I think that's what makes weight and obesity and all these things difficult to treat or difficult to talk about on a population basis, because it is an individual thing and people become super huge for different reasons, but they all become super huge in the same way. I'll put it to you that way, which is drastic overdoing it over a sustained period of time. So the same action may have different reasons, but regardless, if it is trauma-based, that is super TR. That's probably severe TR, or it could become severe if it's mild, and so you need to deal with it immediately.
Which is really far from the truth. Can being emotionally traumatized impact your relationship with food? Absolutely. Could that lead to weight gain? Absolutely. But there are fat people that exist that don't have bad relationships with food.
I don't really know what the point of this statement is. To me, it's giving like, don't assume that I have a problem, which it's like, it's a little bit odd. I've told you guys many times, I don't like the term relationship with food. Food is an inanimate object. You don't have a relationship with an inanimate object. So I think it's strange. I think it's putting emotion into something where it doesn't belong. And you're kind of like projecting emotion into something basic and fundamental to life, or something extremely practical, I guess. So I don't like it. And I think to frame it this way, it is odd. There are fat people that don't have a bad relationship with food. What does that mean? You know what I'm saying? When I hear that, I'm like, what does that even mean?
There are fat people that have just always existed. So the assumption and belittling of,
So I think she's just trying to be like, being huge is natural. That's kind of like her. That's kind of her take.
You're fat because you're traumatized, why are you resistant to weight loss, is extremely dehumanizing. And it's built off this foundational assumption that if it's not the food addiction, you're actually choosing to gain weight to avoid like sexual assault, which is incredibly offensive because...
So I don't know if that's... I don't know if she's playing dumb or if she's just like ignorant, but it's not really that. That's usually not the way that it presents. It's more so that can become a justification after. So what it is it's like in that specific circumstance, especially if we're talking about like severe versions of it, which again, I'm not going to get super detailed. It's more a feeling of like body. Well, I don't want to like get too deep, I guess trigger warning or whatever. I don't want to like upset anybody, but it's kind of like the relationship with your body feels severed in a way. And I'm not talking from experience or anything like that. So if I get anything wrong, you can let me know in terms of that. But it's like there's a separation psychologically, or a mistrust, or all these different things that can go into something like that. And also a feeling of being out of control. And that can be triggering of a toxic ritualistic issue, which can then lead to playing bingo often and doing these things over and over again. So that repetitious behavior leads to the upsizing, and then the upsizing is then justified as I'm doing this to protect myself, or being fat is being safe. I can no longer get kidnapped, something like that, right? So that becomes a justification after the fact. So it's not really like a strategy to prevent it from happening kind of thing. I don't think that that's the way it happens. It's just used as a justification in like a more indirect way, basically. So, or it's a feeling of I'm less vulnerable because my life is more controlled now, because I'm bigger, and so there's less opportunities, or there's less opportunity for spontaneity, basically, if you want to talk about it on like a psychological level. Which again, spontaneity people can develop a fear of spontaneity due to trauma. So I know that that's like really weird to say it in this broken down way, but I would say that that's more so the mechanism rather than like a preemptive strategy to prevent something. I don't think so. I don't.
So many people in larger bodies have been sexually assaulted and aren't believed because they exist in a larger body, right? So it's super gross for a field of mental health to assume that someone has gained weight to avoid sexual assault. If you
So I don't know who she's talking about. If, like I said, I feel like it's a straw man. I would think that I would hope at least that the psychology field would say something like it's a coping strategy for what has happened, type of thing. That's more so what it would be. Like I said, it's not like this isn't cognitive. She's framing it as cognitive. It's not. And what I mean by that is there's no logic behind it, or it isn't like a logical decision. It's visceral, it's emotional. It's, when we're describing emotional trauma specifically, or, what she was saying, SA, that's a more visceral thing. It's a severing connection with the body kind of thing. And that therefore opens you up to having less logic because you're not as grounded to what you're doing. And that's basically how it happens. It's not like you look in the mirror one day and you think, this happened to me, I'm going to do this so that I can prevent it from happening again. No. That's like a rationalization, in my opinion, after the fact.
think that way, then yeah, we have some anti-fatness to work through, and that's totally fine.
But that could be people, if this is real, which I don't know, it could be people in the field of psychology believing somebody who's fat, who's in the TR, and not understanding that they lie all the time. And they do lie to themselves too. Bingo is particularly delusional. I think they all are, but like all of them lie, like all the issues lie, but within bingo, you lie to yourself so much that you can start to like believe your own lies. So it's like you can dissociate in a way, like when you're bingoing, to a point where you don't even know that you did it in some cases. I never had that, but there are some people who do. You can actually totally dissociate. But I was more so like delusional about like the more basic things. So things like I could never lose weight. My weight is genetic. I'll never have the discipline for this, that kind of stuff. Those kind of beliefs, or, like not really believing in caloric realism. That's delusional, right? So things like that. So believing that only the type of food is what matters, that cows don't, that kind of thing is TR Delulu as well. So it can get real weird real fast. And you can go into some strange places diet-wise if you're not careful. So that's the kind of Delulus that you get. But yeah. Or like this, where it's like being so big is natural. There's always been fat people, so this and that, and like that's, it's that kind of rationalization. Like she's engaging in the rationalization herself. So this is exactly what I'm talking about. She's somebody that's doing that. I don't think that she's had something necessarily that bad happen, or at least she hasn't gotten that deep in the TR yet. But she's giving that, it might also be hitting her because maybe it's hitting close to home. I don't know what happened to her. I can't assume that, I don't think you can assume what happened to somebody, but you can kind of tell sometimes that something did. At least I can.
I'm holding space for that. But for the field to think that way is really gross. So, yeah. Hi.
Yeah, so I think it's just odd. I know this is probably a weird way to cover this tonight, but like I said, I'm depressed and I feel weird. So I was like, I might as well just talk about something weird like this. My point is, not all fat people have had trauma in the sense that the trauma caused the fatness. But people who are very traumatized do go into the TR and they can become very big. So I agree with her on that point. Where I disagree with her, like with her statement, is where she's saying that some fat people are fat naturally. I don't agree with that. I think that's TR logic, or that's a TR belief. Basically, it's not real. And I think that it's like she's trying to shield from accountability. Like that's where I know she's in it. Because you don't have to, like, if you are not in the TR, you don't have to lie about what you're doing. You would just say, yeah, I overdo it. But she can't say that. She has to be like, I naturally am this way. Fat people are naturally this way. It's like, you get me? So, I don't know. Let's read this caption. This conversation is incredibly nuanced. In no way am I saying that someone who has chosen to increase eating to avoid unwanted attention isn't suffering. However, the basis of that assumption being that being a larger body is undesirable, therefore safe from attack or attention, is insanely invalid. See, it's just so bizarre. I think this is such a weird thing. It's like she's bothered. Again, she's a stalker. She's bothered by the comparison or the competitive side of, like, how dare you say I'm less attractive? Which is like, whoa, weird. Which is why I don't even trust what she heard. I feel like she is kind of projecting on what she heard. So many things can be true at once. We can have a poor relationship with food that messes with our body. We could engage in diet culture that messes with the weight of our body. That doesn't mean that processing our relationship with food would lead to downsizing. Fat people are not skinny, traumatized people just waiting to be freed. I think that this whole thing, I think it's hard to react to because it's such a confusing statement and sentiment in general. I don't really know what she's trying to say. And I don't know if it's that I'm in my post-migraine, so I can't understand her, if there is nothing to understand. Because it's really weird. So that's my thoughts, I guess. I don't like how short this video is. I almost want to do another one. Let me look for another one. Okay, so I like this because it's like weirdly undermines what she just said in a way. What are some impacts of fat trauma lowered self-worth impacting personal goals, neglecting the body due to shame or avoidance, poor boundaries in relationships due to fear of rejection, vulnerable to domestic to DV due to perceived lower self-worth, avoidance of general medical care due to fears of reported blank, social isolation due to fear of judgment from others. Wouldn't these all be signs of trauma though, as well? Like even if weight isn't involved? Couldn't this be a complicating factor of the toxic ritualistic? Because I feel like the toxic ritualistic does all these things to you too, because it affects you mentally. It makes you like hyper obsessed with how you look and all this weird stuff. And then it can also make you have nutrient deficiencies, and make you go totally nuts, basically. So couldn't that be a part of this too? Because I've told you guys a lot too, like from the bingo side, when you're fully in bingo and you're like all about it, it feels like you're drunk all the time in a way. So you have issues with boundaries with people because it's like you're in a fog. I used to call it the hypo haze, the hypothyroid haze. And so you can't read what people are doing. You can't read people's intentions. You don't have as much empathy. And to me, I feel like all of these things are symptoms of trauma too, like in general. So it's like, I just think it's weird. It's a very weird thing. But anyways, it's a weird contradiction to her other post. Let's look at the caption. The dehumanization of larger bodied people directly impacts their everyday life. This list doesn't even touch on impacts of anti-fatness in medical care, exclusionary practices, and nervous system damage. A fat joke isn't just a flippant comment, but has long-term impacts on the lives of fat people. No one can thrive when their existence is considered negative or a burden. So the fact that they believe that a fat joke would make all of this the case is wild to me. This type of stuff is like genuine trauma. Even the avoidance of medical care, it could have to do with not trusting certain industries or not trusting institutions. For example, it could have to do with having health trauma. So having an issue where you've been traumatized by a health issue, it could make you not want to go. It's like, to me, this is all giving trauma, basically, especially if somebody had all these things at the same time. How could you say that they weren't traumatized in some way? Or is that person naturally like that? It's just odd, right? I find that so weird. And it's like, okay, so we're supposed to believe that a fat joke can cause this, but you don't think that you'd have to be somewhat traumatized for a fat joke to cause that? I think so. Like, this would be severe. This is like a severe issue. Like, I had a lot of these issues, but I was very deep in the TR. And I don't think it was fat trauma. I think it was BINGE. Some of it was BINGE trauma, so just from the actual DIS order. And some of it is from the trauma that inspired it. So I'm just saying, it's just odd. It's odd, y'all. I'm going to just leave it there. I'm sorry if this video was weird, but I feel weird tonight. So hopefully I'll be feeling better next week. I'm still going to see members tonight. I'll talk to you guys later. I'm going to film my members video tomorrow, though, so hopefully I'll be okay. I'll be over this migraine. Because, damn, this one hit me hard. But I will talk to you guys later. Bye.